The paradox of identity asks a simple yet profound question: what makes something remain the same over time? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. A chair will still be a chair tomorrow, and a person remains themselves from one day to the next. But when you look deeper, identity reveals itself as far more intricate. Objects change. People grow. Even the smallest shift in form, function, or thought invites the unsettling question: is it still the same? Imagine a wooden ship sailing the seas for years. Over time, some of its planks rot and are replaced with new ones. I'd love to invite you to share in the comments. Where are you listening from? And what time is it there? It's incredible to realize how these stories and ideas weave us together across distance and time. If you enjoy these thought-provoking explorations, consider subscribing to Tired Thinker, so we can continue bringing you reflective narratives. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift as we dive into the mind-bending paradoxes and mysteries of identity. As the ship's journey continues, every single plank is eventually swapped out. Is it still the same ship? This is the classic ship of Theseus' thought experiment. Some argue it remains the same because the change was gradual and its purpose endures. Others claim it's no longer the same vessel because none of its original materials survive. The paradox deepens. If you gathered all the discarded planks and rebuilt another ship, which would be the true ship of Theseus, the one still afloat or the one made from its original parts? And this puzzle doesn't end with ships. It applies to everything, including ourselves. Consider your body. Your cells are constantly dying and being replaced. By some estimates, nearly every cell in your body is renewed every 7 to 10 years. If your entire physical body is essentially new, are you still the same person? Most people would instinctively say yes, because memory, personality, and sense of self remain. But what happens when memory fades, or behavior changes dramatically? Is a person with memory loss or a transformed personality still the same individual they once were? The paradox grows even more tangled with modern technology. Imagine a person who slowly replaces body parts with advanced prosthetics and synthetic organs. One arm, then both legs, then even the heart. As long as the brain remains intact, most would still consider them the same person. But what if the brain itself is gradually replaced by artificial parts? At what point do they stop being human? If their entire body and mind are eventually artificial, is the person still the same? Or have they become someone, or something, entirely different? The paradox touches the objects we cherish too. Think of a family heirloom, a chair passed down for generations. Over time, pieces wear out, a leg breaks and is replaced, the cushion is reupholstered. Eventually, every part is renewed. Is it still the same chair? To the family, perhaps yes, because meaning and memory linger. But to an outsider, it may appear to be a completely different object. This tension between material reality and emotional significance lies at the very heart of the paradox. Identity becomes even murkier when applied to ideas. Take a novel. If you rewrite it, one chapter at a time, adding new details and altering old ones, at what point does it become a new book? Or think of a country. Borders shift, governments fall, populations change, yet we continue to call it by the same name. Is it still the same country? In both cases, identity clings not to material sameness but to continuity and function. This tension, between physical change and persistent identity, is why defining sameness is so difficult. Some philosophers argue that identity hinges on persistence through time. As long as there's a clear thread linking past and present, something remains itself. A river, for instance, never holds the same water, yet we call it the same river because its flow and place endure. This view emphasizes process and purpose over material. Others argue the opposite, that identity is rooted in original components. According to them, the ship of Theseus ceases to be the same ship once all its parts are replaced. Likewise, a person who has completely renewed their body and mind might no longer be the same individual. In some cases, identity depends entirely on perspective. A classic car rebuilt with all new parts might still be considered the same beloved car by its owner, but not by a collector seeking authenticity. A band continuing under the same name after all its original members have left may still be the same band to fans, but not to critics. These examples show how identity is shaped less by objective facts than by context and interpretation. The paradox of identity isn't just theoretical, it has real-world implications. In medicine, Questions arise about defining a person in cases of severe brain injury or advanced dementia. If someone loses memory and personality, are they still the same individual? Such dilemmas affect decisions about care, autonomy, and legal responsibility. In technology, the rise of AI and machine learning raises urgent questions. If a program evolves over time, at what point does it become something fundamentally new? And on a personal level, the paradox challenges our understanding of ourselves. We like to think of identity as stable, but that's an illusion. People grow, adapt, and transform constantly. The person you are today is not who you were 10 years ago. Your values, beliefs, and preferences evolve. And yet, you continue to think of yourself as you. This continuity is a product of memory and narrative, a story you tell yourself, connecting past, present, and future into a coherent whole. This story guides you through life, even as its details shift and change. At its core, the paradox of identity forces us to confront the fluid nature of existence. Nothing remains entirely the same, yet we hold fast to the idea of permanence. This tension, between change and continuity, is what makes life so rich and so deeply complex. It reminds us that identity isn't a fixed property, it's a living process. Whether it's a ship, a person, or an idea, identity is shaped by continuity, function, and perception. Understanding this helps us appreciate the beauty of change, while still valuing the threads that give meaning to our lives. In the end, the paradox of identity has no simple solution. It invites us to think deeply about what makes something, or someone, the same across time. Whether we focus on material, continuity, or perspective, the answer will always depend on context. And that uncertainty is precisely what makes the paradox so captivating. It reveals the intricate complexity of the world, and of our own struggle to make sense of it. And perhaps, that very struggle is part of what defines us. Imagine now a machine that can offer you the perfect life. Once you step inside, it connects to your mind, stimulating your brain to create a vivid world where everything unfolds exactly as you desire. You experience happiness, success, fulfillment, without any of the hardships or pain of the real world. This is the premise of the Experience Machine, a thought experiment introduced by philosopher Robert Noyce. It asks a simple but profound question: if you could plug into such a machine, would you? At first the idea sounds appealing. Who wouldn't want a perfect life? The machine can give you any experience you desire. You could feel the joy of achieving your biggest dreams, whether it's becoming a world-renowned artist exploring the stars or finding true love in this virtual reality. Everything feels just as real as it does. Outside the machine, you wouldn't know. You were connected to it for all you're aware. This perfect life is your reality. The only decision you have to make is whether to step inside, but something about this choice feels unsettling. If everything is perfect, why hesitate? The machine guarantees happiness, so shouldn't it be an obvious decision? Yet for many people, the idea of plugging in doesn't sit right. There's a nagging sense that something important would be lost, but what exactly would that be? One concern is authenticity. When you're in the machine, the experiences aren't real. Sure, they feel real, but they're not. If you win an Olympic gold medal in the machine, you didn't actually train for it or compete. The machine made you feel like you did, but the achievement isn't genuine. Many people value authenticity in their lives. They want their accomplishments to be earned, not handed to them by a device. This makes the idea of living in the machine less appealing. It's like the difference between climbing a mountain yourself and being flown to the top. The view might be the same, but the experience is fundamentally different. Another issue is the loss of connection to the real world. In the machine, you're alone. The people you interact with aren't real. They're simulations. They might seem like friends or family, but they are not truly there. In the real world, relationships are built through shared experiences, trust, and vulnerability. These connections give life meaning. If you're in the machine, those connections disappear. Even if the machine makes you feel loved, it's not the same as being loved by a real person. There's also the question of personal growth. Life is full of challenges, and those challenges shape who you are. Struggling with failure, overcoming obstacles, and learning from mistakes are all part of being human. They build resilience, empathy, and wisdom. In the machine, those struggles don't exist. Everything goes your way, so you never have to grow or adapt. While this might sound pleasant, it raises the question of whether you can truly appreciate happiness without experiencing hardship. Is a life without challenges really fulfilling, or does it lose some Of its depth, the experience machine also brings up questions about freedom. When you're in the machine, your life is pre-programmed. You're not making real choices because the machine is deciding everything for you, even though it feels like you're in control. You're not. This loss of agency is troubling to many people. Part of what makes life meaningful is the ability to make decisions and shape your own path in the machine. That freedom is an illusion. Some argue that plugging into the machine would be selfish while you're living a perfect life. The real world continues. Problems like poverty, injustice, and environmental destruction still exist, but you're no longer part of the solution. By choosing the machine, you're choosing to ignore those issues and focus only on your own happiness. For people who find meaning in helping others, this would make the machine an unacceptable choice. On the other hand, there are those who argue that plugging into the machine isn't all that different from how we already live. People pursue pleasure, success, and happiness in their everyday lives. They seek out entertainment, relationships, and achievements to feel fulfilled. If the machine provides those things more effectively, why not use it? If happiness is the ultimate goal, the machine seems like a shortcut to achieving it. But happiness might not be the only goal. Noakes' thought experiment suggests that people value more than just feeling good. They value reality, growth, connection, and freedom. These things can involve discomfort, pain, and struggle, but they also bring meaning to life. The machine eliminates the bad, but it also takes away the good that comes from overcoming adversity and engaging with the real world. It replaces genuine experiences with artificial ones, and for many that trade-off is too steep. The thought experiment doesn't have a right or wrong answer. It's designed to make you think about what matters most to you. Is happiness enough, or do you need something more? Would you choose a perfect illusion over an imperfect reality? The experience machine forces us to confront these questions and examine our values. Even if you decide not to plug into the machine, the idea challenges you to think about how you live your life. Are you chasing experiences that feel good in the moment but lack real substance? Are you prioritizing authenticity, growth, and connection even when they are difficult? The machine might not exist, but the choices it represents are very real. Ultimately, the experience machine highlights the complexity of human desires. We want happiness, but we also want meaning. We want comfort, but we also want challenge. We want control, but we also want spontaneity. Life is a balance act between these competing desires, and the thought experiment reminds us that there are no easy answers. Whether or not you would plug into the machine, thinking about it can help you clarify what truly matters in your life. The Munchausen trilemma is a philosophical concept that explores the difficulty of proving anything with absolute certainty. It asks a fundamental question: how do we justify the reasons we give for what we believe? At first glance, it might seem like a simple problem to solve. You might think that if you provide good reasons for your belief, then the belief is justified. But when you dig deeper, the process of justification becomes more complicated. The Munchausen trilemma points out that any attempt to justify a belief inevitably leads to one of three unsatisfying outcomes: circular reasoning, infinite regress, or an arbitrary assumption. To understand this better, let's start with the name. The term Munchausen refers to Baron Munchausen, a fictional character known for telling exaggerated and impossible stories. One of his most famous tales describes how he pulled himself out of a swamp by his own hair, or in some versions, by his own bootstraps. The story is of course absurd because no one can lift themselves by their own bootstraps, yet the idea of attempting the impossible is at the heart of this trilemma. The trilemma suggests that trying to justify knowledge is like trying to pull yourself out of a swamp without any external help. It's a task doomed to fail. Now let's break down the three options that the trilemma presents. The first is circular reasoning. In this case, you justify a belief by using another belief that eventually leads back to the original belief. For example, imagine someone says, "I know my friend always tells the truth because they said they do." This reasoning is circular because the statement depends on itself for validation. Circular reasoning might feel convincing in the moment, but it doesn't provide any real foundation. It's like walking in a circle and expecting to arrive at a new destination. The second option is infinite regress. This happens when every justification requires another justification, creating an endless chain. Imagine a child asking their parent why the sky is blue. The parent might say, "Because light from the sun scatters in the atmosphere." The child then asks, "Why does light scatter?" The parent explains further, and the child continues to ask why after each answer. While each response may be valid, the process could go on forever. Infinite regress might seem more rigorous than circular reasoning, but it has its own problem. It never provides a final answer without a stopping point. The chain of justification is incomplete, leaving the original belief unsupported. The third option is an arbitrary assumption. This means stopping the chain of justification by accepting something as true without proof. For example, someone might say the sky is blue because that's just the way it is. This approach avoids circular reasoning and infinite regress, but it relies on accepting a statement without evidence. Arbitrary assumptions are often unsatisfying because they feel Like a dead end, they provide no deeper understanding of why something is true. The Minchu trilemma argues that every attempt to justify a belief will end in one of these three outcomes. No matter how hard we try, we can't escape the trilemma. This realization has significant implications for philosophy, science, and even everyday life. It challenges the idea that we can ever achieve absolute certainty about anything. In science, for example, we rely on observations and experiments to justify our understanding of the world. But scientific theories are based on assumptions, like the idea that the laws of nature are consistent over time. We can test these assumptions, but even those tests depend on other assumptions. The trilemma suggests that science, while incredibly powerful, is ultimately built on foundations that cannot be fully justified. This doesn't mean science is unreliable, it just means that absolute certainty is out of reach. In philosophy, the trilemma highlights the difficulty of defining knowledge. Philosophers often describe knowledge as justify true belief, meaning that for something to count as knowledge it must be true and you must have good reasons for believing it. But the Munchausen trilemma complicates this definition. If every justification eventually leads to circular reasoning, infinite regress, or an arbitrary assumption, can we ever truly justify a belief? This question has led some philosophers to embrace skepticism, the idea that we cannot know anything with certainty. Even in everyday life, the trilemma plays a role. Think about debates or arguments where someone demands proof for a claim. At some point, every argument reaches a point where no further justification is possible. For example, if someone asks why stealing is wrong, you might say because it harms others. If they then ask why harming others is wrong, you might respond because we should treat others with respect. But if they ask why respect is important, you might struggle to provide a deeper answer. Eventually, the justification will rely on a value or assumption that cannot be proven. Does this mean we should give up on trying to justify our beliefs? Not necessarily. While the trilemma shows that absolute certainty is unattainable, it doesn't mean that all beliefs are equally valid. Some justifications are stronger than others, even if they aren't perfect. In science, for instance, theories are judged by how well they explain observations and predict future outcomes. While we can't justify these theories with absolute certainty, we can evaluate them based on their usefulness and reliability. Similarly, in philosophy, the trilemma encourages us to examine our assumptions and think critically about our beliefs. By acknowledging the limits of justification, we can approach knowledge with humility and openness. This doesn't mean abandoning beliefs altogether. It means recognizing that they are always provisional, subject to change. As we learn more in practical terms, the Munchausen trilemma reminds us that seeking certainty is not always the best goal. Instead, we can focus on finding the most reasonable or coherent explanations available. For example, in a court of law, decisions are made based on evidence and arguments, not absolute proof. While the legal system acknowledges that mistakes can happen, it operates on the principle of reaching the best possible conclusion based on the available information. The trilemma also teaches us to be mindful of the limitations of our reasoning when engaging in debates or discussions. It's important to recognize when an argument relies on circular reasoning, infinite regress, or arbitrary assumptions. By identifying these patterns, we can evaluate arguments more effectively and avoid being misled. Ultimately, the Munchausen trilemma is a reminder of the complexity of knowledge and the limits of human understanding. It challenges us to think deeply about how we justify our beliefs and to accept that some questions may never have definitive answers. While this might seem unsettling, it can also be liberating. By letting go of the need for absolute certainty, we can embrace curiosity, explore new ideas, and continue the never-ending quest for understanding. The trilemma doesn't close the door on knowledge, it opens the door to deeper inquiry. The problem of evil is one of the oldest and most debated questions in philosophy and theology. It asks how a benevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient God can exist with the presence of evil and suffering in the world. This question has puzzled thinkers for centuries, as it raises profound challenges to our understanding of morality, free will, and the nature of the divine. If God is all-loving, it seems logical that he would want to eliminate suffering. If he is all-powerful, he would have the ability to do so, and if he is all-knowing, he would be aware of all suffering, yet suffering persists. This apparent contradiction forms the heart of the problem. To make this clearer, consider a specific example. Imagine a natural disaster such as an earthquake that devastates an entire region. Thousands of people die, including children, and those who had no role in causing the event. Survivors are left homeless, grieving, and struggling to rebuild their lives. If God is both loving and capable, why would he allow such an event to happen? For many, this type of scenario serves as evidence that either God does not exist or that he is not as loving or powerful as religious texts claim. Some theologians argue that evil and suffering exist because of free will. This is known as the free will defense. According to this view, God gave humans free will so they could make their own choices. While free will allows for love, kindness, and creativity, it also opens the door to selfishness, cruelty, and harm. God, they argue, does not intervene. Because doing so would take away the very freedom that makes us human. Without free will, humans would be little more than robots incapable of genuine relationships or moral growth. Evil in this view is a consequence of the freedom God gave us, while the free will defense explains moral evil such as acts of violence or cruelty committed by humans. It does not fully account for natural evil. Natural evil refers to suffering caused by events beyond human control like earthquakes, hurricanes, or diseases. Why would a loving God create a world where such suffering is possible? One answer is that natural disasters and diseases are part of the natural order of the universe. The Earth's tectonic plates shift, creating earthquakes, but this same process also makes life possible by shaping the planet's surface. Diseases evolve through natural selection, but this same process drives the diversity of life on Earth. In this view, suffering is an unavoidable consequence of the physical laws that make life possible. Some argue that suffering serves a greater purpose even if we cannot always understand it. This perspective is known as the soul-making theodicy. According to this view, challenges and hardships help us grow spiritually and morally. Facing adversity can teach compassion, resilience, and humility. For example, a person who survives a difficult illness might develop a deeper appreciation for life or a stronger sense of empathy for others. From this perspective, suffering is not meaningless. It is part of a larger plan designed to shape us into better beings. However, this explanation raises further questions. If suffering is meant to teach us something, why do some people experience far more suffering than others? And what about instances of suffering that seem utterly pointless, such as the death of an innocent child? It is difficult to see how such tragedies could contribute to soul-making. Critics argue that this defense often feels inadequate in the face of immense and senseless suffering. Another perspective suggests that our understanding of God's actions is limited by our human perspective. This is known as the greater good defense. According to this view, God's ways are beyond human comprehension. What appears to us as unnecessary suffering might serve a purpose we cannot see. For example, an event that seems tragic might lead to positive changes in the long run, or it might play a role in a divine plan that we cannot fully grasp. This argument relies on the idea that humans have a limited view of reality while God sees the bigger picture. Critics of this view argue that it asks for too much faith. If we cannot understand God's reasons, how can we be sure that those reasons are just? Furthermore, the idea that suffering might serve a hidden purpose can feel deeply unsatisfying to those who are experiencing pain. It is difficult to find comfort in the idea of a greater good when one is faced with personal tragedy. For atheists and skeptics, the problem of evil is often seen as evidence against the existence of an all-powerful and all-loving God. They argue that the simplest explanation for the existence of evil is that there is no divine being controlling the universe. Instead, the world operates according to natural laws, and suffering is a consequence of those laws. In this view, earthquakes happen because of tectonic activity, not because of any divine purpose. Diseases spread because of biological processes, not because of a test of faith or character. While this perspective removes the problem of reconciling God with evil, it raises other questions, such as how we find meaning in a world without divine oversight. Religious believers often respond to these challenges by pointing out the limits of human understanding. They argue that faith is about trusting in God even when his actions seem incomprehensible. For many, faith provides comfort in the face of suffering, offering the hope of a better future or an afterlife where justice will be restored. This perspective emphasizes the importance of trust and humility in the face of life's mysteries. The problem of evil remains one of the most complex and enduring questions in philosophy and theology. It challenges our assumptions about the nature of God, the purpose of suffering, and the limits of human understanding. While there is no definitive answer, the debate itself has deepened our understanding of morality, free will, and the human condition. Whether one sees suffering as a test of faith, a consequence of natural laws, or simply a part of life, the problem of evil forces us to grapple with some of the most profound questions about existence. The unexpected gift paradox is a fascinating puzzle about surprise and expectations. It challenges the way we think about surprises and how we process information. At first glance, the idea seems straightforward. You are told you will receive a surprise gift at some point during the week. The key to the gift is that it must be unexpected. But as you start to think about when the surprise might happen, the paradox begins to unravel itself. To understand how the paradox works, imagine being told on Sunday evening that you will receive the surprise gift on one day between Monday and Friday. However, you are told it will happen on a day when you least expect it. Naturally, you start to think through the The possibilities first, you consider Friday. If the surprise hasn't happened by Thursday evening, you might conclude that it must happen on Friday. But if you expect it on Friday, it can no longer be a surprise. Therefore, Friday is ruled out. Now that Friday is eliminated, you turn to Thursday. If the surprise hasn't come by Wednesday evening, you might conclude that it must happen on Thursday. But just like before, if you expect it on Thursday, it's no longer a surprise, so Thursday must also be ruled out. This same reasoning applies to Wednesday, Tuesday, and Monday. By the end of this thought process, it seems impossible for the gift to be a surprise on any day. Here's where the paradox really takes hold. Despite this logical reasoning, the surprise can still occur. Let's say it happens on Wednesday. On Tuesday night, you might have ruled out Wednesday as a possibility based on the logic you followed earlier. But when the surprise happens on Wednesday, you are genuinely caught off guard. The paradox lies in the tension between your reasoning and the actual event. Even though you think you've eliminated all possibilities, the surprise still works. What makes this paradox so intriguing is how it challenges our assumptions about logic and expectations. The key to the puzzle is in the phrase least expect. The idea of a surprise hinges on the fact that you cannot fully anticipate it, but as soon as you try to reason through when it might happen, you introduce an expectation, which complicates the very idea of being surprised. This paradox has deeper implications than it may seem at first. It reveals the limits of logical reasoning when applied to certain kinds of situations. Logical deduction assumes that we can predict outcomes based on available information, but surprises by their nature defy prediction. The unexpected gift paradox highlights how our efforts to anticipate something can sometimes undermine the experience itself. It also shows how language and the way we interpret it plays a central role in shaping our expectations. The paradox can be extended to other situations beyond the idea of a gift. Consider the scenario of a surprise test in a classroom. A teacher tells students that there will be a surprise test sometime during the week. The same reasoning applies. If the test hasn't happened by Thursday night, the students might assume it will occur on Friday, making it no longer a surprise. By this logic, the test can't happen on any day, yet when the test actually takes place, perhaps on Wednesday, the students are genuinely surprised. This version of the paradox is often called the unexpected exam paradox, and it follows the same principles. One way to think about this puzzle is to examine how humans process uncertainty when faced with an unpredictable situation. We often try to create certainty by analyzing possibilities. We eliminate options, narrow the field, and draw conclusions based on what we know, but surprises operate in a space where information is incomplete or deliberately obscured. The more we try to predict a surprise, the harder it becomes to let the surprise happen naturally. This is the trap of the unexpected gift paradox. The more you try to predict, the more your reasoning gets tangled in its own contradictions. The paradox also raises questions about how much we trust the information we're given. When someone tells you that a surprise will happen, do you fully believe them, or do you start to second-guess their words, thinking they might not follow through? This element of trust adds another layer to the puzzle. If you doubt the statement, you may dismiss the possibility of the surprise altogether, which changes how you approach the situation. On the other hand, if you take the statement at face value, you find yourself caught in the loop of overthinking every possible outcome. Another way to explore the paradox is to think about how it mirrors real-life experiences. Many of life's surprises come when we aren't actively looking for them. For example, you might receive an unexpected call from an old friend, stumble upon a beautiful place during a walk, or find an answer to a problem when you least expected. These moments are surprising precisely because you weren't trying to anticipate them. The unexpected gift paradox captures this dynamic by showing how deliberate attempts to predict a surprise often backfire despite its playful nature. This paradox has been studied by philosophers and logicians for decades. It touches on fundamental issues in epistemology, the study of knowledge and belief. The paradox forces us to confront the limits of what we can know and how we can know it. Can we ever be certain of a surprise, or does the very concept of certainty eliminate the possibility of being surprised? These questions reveal the deeper philosophical roots of the puzzle. The paradox also has practical applications in areas like game theory and decision-making. In competitive situations, anticipating the actions of others often leads to similar loops of reasoning. If one player tries to predict the other's move, they might overthink and misjudge the situation. Understanding the dynamics of the unexpected gift paradox can help in recognizing when overanalysis becomes counterproductive. Ultimately, the beauty of the unexpected gift paradox lies in its simplicity and its depth. On the surface, it's a light-hearted puzzle about surprise and timing, But as you dig deeper, it reveals profound truths about human reasoning expectations and the nature of surprise itself. The paradox invites us to embrace uncertainty and accept that not everything can be anticipated or explained. Sometimes the best way to experience a surprise is to stop trying to figure it out and simply let it happen. The drinker's paradox is a logic puzzle that seems absurd at first glance but makes perfect sense upon closer examination. It states that in any bar, there is at least one person, such that if that person drinks, everyone else in the bar drinks as well. This statement feels counterintuitive, almost ridiculous, but it is a valid logical conclusion based on how it is structured. To understand the drinker's paradox, it's essential to break it down step by step, examining how logic operates in this case, and why such a surprising statement holds true. To begin, it's important to recognize that the paradox relies on a basic principle of formal logic, specifically the idea of implications in logic. A statement of the form if A then B is considered true unless A is true and B is false. This means that even if A never happens, the statement as a whole is still true. For example, take the statement, if it rains tomorrow, I will stay indoors. If it doesn't rain tomorrow, the statement is still true because the condition for testing it rain never occurs. This idea is central to understanding the drinker's paradox because the paradox hinges on how implications function, not on the practical realities of drinking behavior. Now imagine a bar filled with people. Some are drinking, some are not. The claim is that there is at least one person in the bar, such that if that person drinks, everyone else drinks too. To illustrate, let's consider our two scenarios. In the first, everyone in the bar is already drinking. In this case, the paradox is easily satisfied because the condition is trivially true. If everyone is drinking, you can pick any person in the bar, and the statement holds if this person drinks, everyone drinks. Since everyone is already drinking, the condition is met without complication. The second scenario is more interesting. Not everyone in the bar is drinking. Perhaps some people are drinking and others are not. At first, it might seem impossible to find a person who satisfies the paradox, but the key lies in how the logical structure works. Consider one person who is not drinking. Let's call them Alex. The statement, if Alex drinks, everyone else drinks, is still logically valid because Alex is not drinking. Since the condition of Alex drinking is not met, the statement cannot be proven false and it remains true by default. This is the counterintuitive part of the paradox. As long as the condition Alex drinking doesn't happen, the statement is logically satisfied. The drinker's paradox forces us to think about the difference between practical scenarios and logical ones. In real life, we might try to connect cause and effect, asking how could one person's drinking influence everyone else in the bar, but the paradox is not concerned with causation. It only cares about the logical relationship between conditions. Whether or not people in the bar actually influence one another is irrelevant. What matters is that the statement, if this person drinks, then everyone drinks, can never be proven false, even if it feels strange or unrealistic. To make this even clearer, let's take a different example that follows the same logical structure. Imagine a park with a group of people. Someone claims there is at least one person in the park, such that if they clap their hands, everyone else claps too. This might sound impossible, but the logic holds. If no one claps, the condition is satisfied because the person's clapping never occurs, so the statement remains true by default. If everyone is already clapping, the condition is also satisfied. In either case, the logic checks out, even if a scenario feels disconnected from reality. The paradox is not just a playful puzzle, it also highlights how formal logic can produce results that seem counterintuitive. In everyday thinking, we often rely on intuition or practical reasoning, which can lead us to reject statements like the drinker's paradox as nonsensical. However, logic operates on strict rules that don't always align with our natural instincts. By examining cases like this one, we can see how logic follows its own internal consistency even when the conclusions seem strange. The drinker's paradox also invites reflection on how we interpret language and reasoning. In natural language, statements often carry implied context or assumptions. For example, if someone says, if I win the lottery, I'll buy a car, we might assume they're talking about a realistic situation where they could win, but in formal logic, the statement is true even if they never buy a ticket. The drinker's paradox strips away these assumptions and forces us to engage with the raw mechanics of logical implication. It challenges us to think carefully about what we mean when we say something is true or false. One of the reasons the drinker's paradox is so intriguing is that it can apply to any situation where implications are involved. It doesn't have to be about drinking in a bar. The same reasoning applies to any condition paired with a universal statement. For instance, you could say, in any classroom, there is at least one student, such that if they stand up, everyone else stands too. The structure is identical and the logical conclusion remains valid. The specific details don't matter. What matters is how the logic is constructed. In philosophy, paradoxes like this one are useful tools for exploring the limits of reasoning. They show how logic can produce unexpected results and help clarify the difference between logical truth and Practical truth, the drinker's paradox, is especially valuable because it demonstrates how seemingly nonsensical statements can hold up under scrutiny. It teaches us to question our assumptions and approach problems with a more precise understanding of logic. Ultimately, the drinker's paradox is a reminder that logic doesn't always align with our expectations. It asks us to set aside common sense and focus on the structure of reasoning itself. By doing so, we gain a deeper appreciation for how logic works and why it sometimes leads us to surprising conclusions, whether in a bar, park, or classroom. The paradox holds true, showing us that logic, even at its most counterintuitive, is a powerful tool for understanding the world. Imagine you are stranded on an island where every inhabitant belongs to one of two groups: truth tellers or liars. The truth tellers always tell the truth, while the liars always lie. On this island, you have a single task: figure out who belongs to which group. At first glance, this seems like it might be simple. Surely you can just ask someone a question and deduce whether they are truthful or not. But as you start to think it through, the problem becomes more complex. If someone lies all the time, how do you know whether their answer is deceptive or not? What kind of questions could help you untangle the truth in such a scenario? The challenge begins when you realize that asking direct questions won't help. For example, if you ask someone, "Are you a truth tell?" both a truth tell and a liar would answer yes. A truth tell would truthfully say they tell the truth, while a liar, compelled to lie, would falsely claim to be a truth teller. You gain no useful information from this exchange. To solve this puzzle, you must think carefully about how to phrase your questions in a way that exploits the logic of the truth tellers and liars. A classic approach is to ask about what another person would say. Imagine there are two people on the island standing next to you. You could ask person A, what would person B say if I asked them whether you are a truth teller? This question creates a logical loop. A truth tell, when answering this question, will truthfully describe the liar's answer. A liar, on the other hand, will lie about what the truth teller would say. In either case, you can decode the truth by interpreting the response carefully. Here's how it works. If person A is a truth teller, they will truthfully state what person B, the liar, would say. Since person B always lies, they would claim that person A is a liar. Person A would then truthfully report person B would say that I am a liar. If person A is a liar, they will lie about what person B, the truth teller, would say. In this case, person B would truthfully say that person A is a liar, but person A will lie about this and claim person B would say that I am a truth teller. By analyzing this response, you can determine who is who. A liar always manipulates the answer in a way that exposes their dishonesty. If you follow the logic, this type of reasoning feels abstract, but it becomes clearer with practice. The key is to structure your questions so that the answer doesn't depend on whether the person is truthful or deceptive. Instead, the question forces them into a logical framework that reveals their nature. Questions like "What would you say if I asked?" or "What would another person say about?" create layers of logic that uncover the truth. This island scenario is not just a fun puzzle, it illustrates how logic can be used to solve seemingly impossible problems. The truth tellers and liars problem has been studied for centuries, partly because it is simple to state but complex to solve. It is often used in philosophy and computer science to teach principles of logic, reasoning, and decision-making. It forces you to think beyond surface-level answers and consider the deeper structure of how information is conveyed. One of the most fascinating aspects of this puzzle is how it forces you to rely on indirect reasoning. Most of the time, we are accustomed to taking answers at face value or seeking direct information on the island. However, direct questions fail because the truth and lies sound identical on the surface. This reflects a broader lesson about communication in the real world. People often frame statements in ways that can obscure their intentions. Learning to ask the right questions, questions that reveal more than they conceal, is a skill that applies far beyond the island. The problem also highlights the power of self-referential questions. By asking someone what another person would say, you create a scenario where both groups must indirectly expose themselves. This type of reasoning is closely related to the concept of metacognition, or thinking about thinking. It encourages you to step back and analyze how information flows and where the hidden truths lie in some variations of the puzzle. The complexity increases. Imagine that there are not just truth tellers and liars, but also people who randomly alternate between truth and lies. Now, asking a single question may not be enough to determine someone's nature. You would need to ask a series of questions and look for consistency or patterns in their responses. This added layer of randomness mirrors real-world situations where people are not perfectly consistent in their behavior or statements. It teaches us to gather more evidence and analyze it over time rather than relying on a single interaction. The beauty of the truth tellers and liars Puzzle is its universality. While it appears simple on the surface, it challenges some of our most basic assumptions about communication, truth, and logic. It shows how even in situations where information is unreliable or contradictory, clear thinking and structured reasoning can cut through the confusion. It also emphasizes the importance of carefully framing your questions to get the answers you need. Imagine applying this principle to everyday life. While we don't often encounter people who always lie or always tell the truth, we do deal with incomplete, biased, or misleading information. Whether you're analyzing a news story, negotiating a deal, or resolving a conflict, the ability to structure your questions and think critically about the answers is invaluable. The Truth Tellers and Liars puzzle serves as a reminder that how we ask questions can be just as important as the answers we receive. At its core, the puzzle is about clarity. It strips away unnecessary complexity and forces you to think logically. The rules are simple. One group always tells the truth, and the other always lies. Within those rules lies a world of complexity, nuance, and discovery. By navigating the puzzle, you learn not just how to solve a riddle, but how to approach problems with patience, curiosity, and a clear mind. The island of truth tellers and liars remains a timeless thought experiment. It challenges you to think beyond the obvious, to question your assumptions, and to look for answers in unexpected places. It's a reminder that even in a world full of contradictions, truth can be found if you know how to ask the right questions. The Epimenides paradox is a classic example of a self-referential statement that creates logical confusion. It originates from the statement made by Epimenides, a philosopher and poet from ancient Crete, who said, "All cretins are liars." At first glance, this might seem straightforward, but when you think about it, a problem emerges. If Epimenides, a Cretan himself, is telling the truth, then his statement must be true. But if it's true, then all, including himself, are liars, which would make his statement false. This contradiction forms the heart of the paradox, and has puzzled thinkers for centuries. The paradox works because it is self-referential. The statement refers to the speaker's own truthfulness, creating a loop that cannot logically resolve. If the statement is true, then it must be false, and if it is false, it cannot be true. This kind of logical problem is what makes the Epimenides paradox so intriguing and enduring. It forces us to confront the limitations of language, logic, and truth in ways that challenge our usual ways of thinking. To understand this paradox more deeply, it's helpful to think about similar examples. Consider the statement, "This sentence is false." If the sentence is true, then it must be false because that is what the sentence claims. But if it's false, then it must actually be true because a false statement about being false is in fact true. This type of loop, where statement contradicts itself, is often called a liar paradox. It appears simple, but it creates a tangle that logic struggles to untie. The Epimenides paradox differs slightly from the standard liar paradox because it is tied to a group rather than just a single statement. By saying all cretins are liars, Epimenides is making a broader claim about the nature of truthfulness within his own group. This adds another layer of complexity. If we assume that all cretins really are liars, then Epimenides cannot be truthful. But if he is not truthful, his statement about all cretins being liars is itself a lie, meaning not all cretins are liars. This creates a cycle of logical inconsistencies. This paradox doesn't just exist as a philosophical curiosity. It has real implications for how we think about truth and self-reference. For example, in the world of mathematics and formal logic, self-referential systems often lead to contradictions. A famous example is Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that in any sufficiently complex system of mathematics, there will always be statements that cannot be proven true or false using the rules of the system itself. Gödel's work was inspired by paradoxes like the one posed by Epen, highlighting how these seemingly simple puzzles can have profound implications. Another way to explore the Epimenides paradox is by considering the role of assumptions. When we hear the statement, "all creatins are liars," we assume that it operates under the usual rules of truth and falsehood. But what if those rules don't apply in the way we expect? For instance, perhaps if amenities meant something less literal, such as cretins often lie or cretins are not entirely trustworthy, why in that case the statement might not be a paradox at all. It could just be an exaggeration or generalization. This shows how much the paradox relies on interpretation. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of lying itself. To call someone a liar suggests that they regularly or habitually tell falsehoods, but does that mean everything they say is false? Not necessarily. A person who lies often can still tell the truth sometimes. If we apply this idea to the Epimenides paradox, we might say that Epimenides is a cretin could be lying about all cretins being liars, but if he is lying, then some cretins must tell the truth, which means his statement could still be partly correct. This blurs the line between truth and falsehood even further. One way to resolve the paradox is to shift the focus from logical absolutes to practical reasoning. In real life, people don't always speak in absolute terms. Statements like everyone lies or nobody is trustworthy are often understood as hyperbole, not literal truth. If we interpret a statement this way, the paradox disappears. It becomes less about a logical contradiction and more about the complexities of human behavior and language. The paradox also connects to broader philosophical questions about self-reference and self-awareness. When someone makes a statement about themselves or their own group, they are both the observer and the observed. This creates a unique challenge for logic, which typically operates on the assumption that the subject and object of a statement are separate. By blurring this distinction, self-referential statements, like all cretins are liars, reveal the limitations of traditional logic and force us to think in new ways. In modern times, the Eepes paradox has been explored in fields beyond philosophy and computer science. For instance, self-referential loops can cause problems in programming. A simple example is a piece of code that says, if true, repeat this command without a condition to break the loop. The program will run indefinitely, much like the logical loop created by the Eepes paradox. This shows how self-reference, while fascinating, can create practical challenges in addition to theoretical ones. Despite its complexity, the Eepes paradox offers valuable insights. It reminds us that language is not always as precise as we might like. Words can have multiple meanings and context matters. It also shows that truth is not always black and white. A statement can be partly true, partly false, or even entirely dependent on how it is interpreted. By grappling with these ideas, we can develop a deeper understanding of how we communicate and think. Ultimately, the Epimenides paradox is a reminder that some questions don't have simple answers. It invites us to explore the boundaries of logic and to consider the ways in which our assumptions shape our understanding of the world. Whether we approach it as a philosophical puzzle, a linguistic curiosity, or a mathematical challenge, the paradox continues to inspire reflection and debate. It demonstrates that even the simplest statements can lead to profound and thought-provoking questions, challenging us to think beyond the limits of conventional reasoning. The two envelopes problem is a fascinating puzzle that challenges our understanding of probability logic and decision-making. It begins with a simple scenario. You are presented with two envelopes, each containing some money. One envelope has exactly twice as much money as the other. You don't know which is which. You choose one envelope, but before you open it, you are given the option to switch to the other. At this point, the question arises, should you switch or should you stick with your original choice? At first glance, the problem seems straightforward. You might think there's no reason to switch after all without knowing which envelope contains more money. Both envelopes seem equally likely to hold the larger amount. Switching would appear to be a 50-50 gamble with no advantage gained, but then a deeper consideration leads to confusion. Let's break it down. Suppose you open your chosen envelope and find $100 inside. If this is the smaller amount, the other envelope must contain $200. However, if this is the larger amount, the other envelope must contain $50. In this case, there's a 50% chance the other envelope holds $200 and a 50% chance it holds $50. On average, switching would give you an expected value of $125 because $200 5 plus $50.50 equal $125. This expected value is higher than the $100 you already have, so it seems like switching is the better choice. But here's the paradox. This logic applies no matter what amount you find in the first envelope. No matter how much money you see, switching always appears to offer a higher expected value. If that's true, then you should always switch. But if the logic applies equally to both envelopes, you could endlessly switch back and forth without ever resolving which envelope is better. This contradiction lies at the heart of the two envelopes problem. To understand where this reasoning goes wrong, we need to dig deeper into the assumptions. The key issue lies in the way probabilities are assigned to the amounts in the envelopes. In the example above, we implicitly assume that each amount has an equal chance of being the smaller or larger amount, but this assumption is problematic. If one envelope contains $100, the other must contain either $50 or $200, depending on whether $100 is the smaller or larger amount. However, the problem doesn't specify how the amounts are distributed initially. Without knowing this, we can't calculate meaningful probabilities. Let's consider another perspective. Suppose the two envelopes were filled according to a specific rule. For example, one envelope contains a randomly chosen amount and the other contains double that amount. If the amounts were chosen in this way, you would need to know the range of possible values before you could assign probabilities. Without that range, it's impossible to determine whether switching is advantageous. This highlights another key feature of the problem. The paradox arises because we are trying to reason about probabilities without sufficient information. Some philosophers and mathematicians argue that the paradox doesn't reflect a real flaw in decision-making, but rather exposes the limitations of how we think about uncertainty in practice. If you're given two envelopes with no additional context, you truly have no way of knowing whether switching is better or worse. The 50% probability abilities assigned to each outcome are based on incomplete reasoning. They don't account for how the money was allocated between the envelopes in the first place. Another way to resolve the paradox is by considering symmetry before you open either envelope. The two options are indistinguishable. There is no information favoring one envelope over the other. This symmetry suggests that there's no rational reason to switch once you've chosen an envelope, even after you open in the first envelope and see a specific amount of money. The problem doesn't provide any new information about whether switching is beneficial. You still don't know how the amounts were distributed, so the situation remains symmetrical in terms of your knowledge. To illustrate this point, imagine playing this game repeatedly with different pairs of envelopes. Over time, you would notice that switching doesn't consistently lead to better outcomes. Some of the time, switching would result in a gain, and other times it would result in a loss. On average, the outcomes would balance out. This reinforces the idea that the initial choice and the decision to switch are equally valid strategies in the absence of additional information. Despite these explanations, the two envelopes problem continues to intrigue people because it challenges intuitive thinking. The paradox tricks our brains into seeing a pattern that isn't really there. The idea of EXP value makes it seem like switching is always better, even though the underlying logic doesn't hold up under scrutiny. This tension between intuition and rational analysis is what makes the problem so compelling. The two envelopes problem also raises broader questions about how we handle uncertainty in everyday life. Decision making often involves incomplete information, and we must rely on assumptions to fill in the gaps. In some cases, these assumptions work well, but in others they lead to errors or paradoxes like this one. The problem reminds us to carefully examine the reasoning behind our choices and to be cautious about overinterpreting probabilities when the underlying assumptions are unclear. Ultimately, the two envelopes problem isn't just a mathematical puzzle, it's a thought experiment that challenges us to think critically about probability symmetry and decision-making. It highlights the importance of understanding the limits of our reasoning and in the role of assumptions in shaping our conclusions. While the paradox may never have a definitive solution, it offers a valuable lesson in how to approach uncertainty with both logic and humility. The problem of the criterion is a classic philosophical puzzle about knowledge. It asks a deceptively simple question: how do we know what we know? To figure out what is true or reliable, we need a method to judge it, but how do we know that method is trustworthy without already knowing what truth looks like? The issue creates a loop where we cannot establish a reliable criterion for knowledge without first having knowledge itself. This circular problem lies at the heart of the debate over how humans understand and verify the world around them. To grasp the problem more clearly, imagine you are trying to determine whether a painting is authentic. You might consult an expert, but how do you know the expert is credible? Perhaps you could check their credentials or see if their previous evaluations have been accurate, but this requires trusting another standard, maybe the institution that granted their credentials or historical records of their evaluations. How do you verify those? At some point you realize there's no ultimate unshakable standard to confirm what is reliable without referring to another possibly flawed standard. This is the essence of the problem of the criterion. This issue was first articulated by the Greek philosopher Sus Empiricus, who questioned whether we could ever truly escape this loop. It's a cornerstone of skepticism. The problem begins with two basic questions: what do we know and how do we decide what to believe? The first question focuses on the scope of our knowledge. The second asks for the standard or criterion by which we judge that knowledge. The problem arises because you can't answer one question without the other. To know what you can trust, you need a method for evaluating it, but to develop that method, you need to already know what's trustworthy. It's a catch-22. Take, for example, scientific reasoning. Most people trust science as a reliable way to learn about the world. Science is based on evidence, experimentation, and observation, but why do we trust evidence and observation? Someone might say that past scientific discoveries have proven accurate and led to practical advancement, so science must be reliable. However, this argument uses science's past successes as evidence for its reliability, which assumes the very method you're trying to validate. This circular reasoning doesn't solve the problem, it just shifts it. The same issue arises in other areas like morality. Imagine you're trying to decide whether an action is right or wrong. You might appeal to a set of moral principles like do no harm, but how do you know that principle is correct? Perhaps you argue it's self-evident, or that it aligns with human nature, or that it produces the best outcomes, but each of these claims requires another standard of judgment. How do you determine that outcomes matter, or that human nature is a valid guide? The chain of reasoning never truly ends. The problem of the criterion isn't just abstract philosophy, it affects real-world decisions. Consider a jury deciding a court case. They have to weigh evidence, testimony, and legal standards to reach a verdict, but how do they decide which evidence is credible? One witness might seem reliable, but how do they know? Maybe their demeanor or consistency makes them convincing, but these judgments rely on assumptions about how truth and reliability manifest. The jury must trust their instincts, previous experience, or expert guidance, none of which are infallible. This doesn't mean the jury can't reach a verdict, but it shows that their decision is built on layers of trust and criteria that can't be fully verified. A similar issue appears in news and media. People often ask, how do I know which sources to trust? Some might say to rely on reputable outlets, but how do we determine which outlets are reputable? Others might suggest cross-referencing information, but that assumes you know which sources to use for comparison. In an age of misinformation, this problem feels especially relevant. The question of how to judge the credibility of information has no easy answer, because it's tied to the large problem of the criterion. One response to the problem is foundationalism. Foundationalists argue that some beliefs or standards are self-evident and don't require further justification. For example, I think therefore I am is often seen as a foundational belief because it's impossible to doubt without affirming its truth. Foundationalism tries to break the circularity by grounding knowledge in these self-evident truths. However, critics argue that what seems self-evident to one person might not to another. What makes something truly foundational, and how do we agree on it? Another response is coherentism. Coherentists reject the idea of foundational beliefs. Instead, they argue that beliefs are justified by how well they fit into a larger coherent system of knowledge. For example, scientific theories are accepted not because of any single piece of evidence, but because they fit together into a logical framework that explains a wide range of phenomena. However, coherentism doesn't escape the loop entirely. It relies on the idea that coherence itself is a valid standard, which still requires justification. Skepticism offers a different approach. Instead of trying to solve the problem, skeptics embrace it. They argue that humans can never achieve absolute certainty. Instead, we should acknowledge the limits of our knowledge and focus on practical probabilistic reasoning. For example, while we can't prove beyond all doubt that science is reliable, its consistent success in producing results makes it reasonable to trust. Skepticism doesn't eliminate the problem of the criterion, but shifts the focus to what works in practice. The problem of the criterion also raises questions about how humans perceive the world. Our senses are the primary way we gather information, but how do we know they are accurate? If you see a red apple, you assume it's red, but your perception depends on your eyes and brain in interpreting light. What if your eyes are faulty? You could check with someone else, but that assumes their perception is accurate. Once again, the chain of trust loops back on itself, despite its complexity. The problem of the criterion doesn't mean humans are incapable of knowledge. Instead, it highlights the assumptions and frameworks we rely on. Acknowledging these limits can lead to greater intellectual humility. It reminds us that every belief, no matter how solid it seems, rests on a foundation of trust in something else. This doesn't make knowledge meaningless, it makes it dynamic and ever-evolving. In everyday life, we often act as if the problem doesn't exist. We make decisions, form beliefs, and trust certain criteria without overanalyzing them. This practical approach works because absolute certainty isn't necessary for most decisions. While philosophers wrestle with the problem of the criterion, most people navigate it unconsciously. We build knowledge based on experience, community standards, and shared assumptions, even if we can't prove those assumptions are infallible. The problem of the criterion challenges us to think deeply about the nature of knowledge and truth. It forces us to confront the limits of human understanding and the frameworks we take for granted. While it doesn't offer easy answers, it opens the door to richer, more thoughtful exploration of what it means to know. Whether in philosophy, science, or everyday life, this problem serves as a